Okay, welcome to today's talk. It's co-sponsored by the Center for Phenomenology, the Simon Silverman Center, as well as by the Philosophy Department. And my colleague Jeff Curry, who's the president, or what is your director of the center, is going to introduce our speaker for today. But I'm going to speak on behalf of the Philosophy Department, who's co-sponsoring it, because this is the first in our speaker series for this year. So besides today's talk, we have on September 22nd, Anton Friedrich Koch of the University of Heidelberg. On October 3rd, we have Douglas Jessup of the University of South Florida. On October 31st, we have Luna Dolezal of Trinity College Dublin. On November 14th, we have Tom Sparrow of Slippery Rock University, and also one of our PhD graduates. And December 5th, we have Paul Loeb of the University of Puget Sound. So if you'd like to be kept up to date about the Philosophy Speaker Series, if you're not on our email list, what I'll ask you to do is just to put your email address and name on this piece of paper, which I'll start circulating around during the introduction. Thank you. Yeah,
I'd like to be president of something. Maybe someday. My name is Jeff McCurry. I am the director of the Phenomenology Center, and it's my pleasure and our pleasure and good fortune to welcome Dr. John Sallis today to the Phenomenology Center and to Duquesne University and the Philosophy Department to give the first lecture of the year in the Philosophy Department Speaker Series. Professor Sallis' visit is especially welcome because, as some of you may know and some of you may not know, he was one of the co-founders of the Phenomenology Center in the late 1970s. We're also grateful that Jerry, John's wife, could be here with us today too. For anyone associated with continental philosophy in the United States and beyond, John Sallis needs little introduction. He is one of the most distinguished philosophers in the phenomenological tradition, working over the past decades up to today. He has taught here at Duquesne University, where we haven't quite forgiven him for leaving, and Loyola University in Chicago, Vanderbilt University, Penn State, and Boston College, where he is currently the Frederick J. Adelmann, S.J. Professor of Philosophy. I'll also mention that Professor Sallis is the recipient of an honorary doctorate of philosophy from Universitat Freiburg. If I were to list all his books, we wouldn't have time for him to give his lecture, but let me mention a few of the most recent. Transfigurements on the True Sense of Art, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2008. Logic of Imagination, The Expanse of the Elemental, with Indiana University Press in 2012. And just this summer, Light Traces, also from Indiana University Press, which came out in June. Today, Professor Sallis will give a lecture entitled Return to Nature. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Sallis.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It's always a pleasure to be back here at Duquesne, which still feels somewhat like a home, as I was here, as Jeff mentioned, for many years. What is to be heard in the phrase, return to nature? Taken most directly, the phrase expresses an imperative. Suppose that it is addressed to someone, or even that in solitude one addresses it to oneself. On those to whom it is addressed, it imposes the demand that they return to nature. As the condition of its pertinence, the imperative presupposes that its addressees either have themselves retreated from nature or have somehow been withdrawn from it, so that in either case they are separated or at least distanced from nature. The imperative enjoins them to return across this distance, to close the space of separation, so as to come again into proximity to nature, so as to arrive once more at the place where they would once have been, even if in a past that would never quite have been present. And yet, in completing such an odyssey, they would come to occupy this place differently. Once immediacy has been disrupted, even if always already, the situation is never again the same as it would have been. Once having been set apart, they return to nature. They will have reinstalled themselves therein with a certain deliberateness. They will perdure within the compass of nature only through resolve, and thus always with a certain residual detachment. The trajectory through which they will have passed will always have left its trace in their comportment. The imperative to return to nature has been repeatedly sounded in the history of philosophy, and the heterogeneity of its sources is indicative of the manifold senses borne by the phrase. It is voiced already in antiquity. It receives one of its most direct expressions in the contrast that Diogenes of Sinope drew between convention and nature, and in his insistence that happiness depends on acting in accordance with nature. The human, in search of happiness, is thus enjoined to measure his actions by reference to nature, by turning or returning to nature as his guide. According to ancient testimony, both Chrysippus and Diogenes of Babylon declared that choice, as in selecting some things and rejecting others, should be exercised in accordance with nature, that is, again, by turning or returning to nature as guide. Reporting the precepts of the Stoics, Stobaeus writes, "All things in accordance with nature are to be taken, and all things contrary to nature are not to be taken." And again, "All things in accordance with nature have worth, and all things contrary to nature are unworthy." The theme is pervasive from the early Cynics throughout much of Stoicism. The measure of actions, of things, and of their worth is to be found by turning or returning to nature, by determining whether they are in accordance with nature, in Greek kataphusen. Thus the return to nature may be carried out in order to secure a proper measure. Actions and dealings with things will then be executed in accord with nature, will be fitted to its measure. Yet the very concept of measure, the differentiation between what provides the measure and what is measured by it, indicates that these instances of human comportment retain a residual detachment from nature itself. They are to be measured by nature, not assimilated to it. The return to nature, as demanded in the imperative, may be carried out in other ways, that is, with other ends in view and in various registers. In the mid-18th century, the imperative was sounded in a form unheard of in antiquity. In his discourse on the origin and basis of inequality among men, the so-called Second Discourse, Rousseau undertook to return descriptively to the human as it existed in its original, that is, savage stage, in what Rousseau calls the state of nature. In recovering and describing the human in the state of nature, his intent is to show how once humans left this state and the development of society commenced, human inequality and hence oppression and injustice came about. Here then, the return to nature is theoretical. It is a matter not of modern men again becoming savages, but only of describing that original state. The description of the state of nature is meant, in turn, to serve a political end, or at least to enable an analysis of modern social political conditions, of the means by which the inequality in modern society came about. Yet in turn, this analysis identifies the customs, laws, and institutions that would need to be dissolved, or at least radically transformed, in order to eliminate inequality and establish a society in which, as was the case with humans in the state of nature, all are equal. Thus Rousseau's descriptive return to nature opens the way to a condition that, though not that of the savage, would, in a way accordant with modern life, approximate the state of nature. Yet within the scope of this return to nature, Rousseau also carries out other, more specific modes of return, returning to nature in other registers. One such register is that of the origin of language. In Rousseau's description of the human condition in the state of nature, it becomes evident that as long as humans were living in such proximity to nature, they had little or no need for language. Only at the threshold of the break with the state of nature did incipient speech first appear, namely as what Rousseau calls the cry of nature, which was uttered only in situations of great danger or violent pain. Later, other sounds besides the mere cry were added. The inflections of the voice were multiplied and combined with gestures. Still later, in order to overcome the limitation of gestures, our progenitors introduced articulate vocal sounds, and language in the proper sense thus began to develop. Hence, through his descriptive return to nature, to humans in the state of nature, Rousseau provides the basis for his account of the origin and development of language. Another register in which Rousseau carries out the return to nature is that of music. In his essay on the origin of languages, which in its full title bears the further designation in which melody and musical imitation are treated, Rousseau focuses on another phase in the development of language. It is a phase that he presents by depicting a kind of primal scene at a fountain or a festival where the passions of lovers-to-be are aroused and speech first flourishes, first comes fully into its own. According to Rousseau, it was here, along the way from the state of nature, that music was born. As it arose, it consisted solely of melody and was bound closely to speech. This was, as it were, music's state of nature. What came later was, perhaps even more than in society at large, a matter of degeneration. With the rationalization of language, separation ensued between speech and song. Then, as harmony became dominant, melody, and hence song, was impaired, so that finally there resulted an expressionless music, forgetful of the voice. Need it be said that through this analysis, Rousseau is proposing a return by which music would come into proximity to its state of nature. Then melody would again become primary, harmony serving only for its enhancement, and song, thus restored, would again follow the accents of speech. This is a proposal that Rousseau not only declared, but also as composer sought to carry out, as in his celebrated opera, Le Devin du Village. In some instances, a return to nature is broached within a highly determined register and within a larger context, committed contrariwise to separation from nature. Consider the case of Kant. Although the critique of pure reason begins by acknowledging the dependence of knowledge on experience, the primary movement enacted in the critical project consists in a regress from experience, primarily from the experience of nature, a regress to the a priori conditions of such experience, conditions that lie not in nature, but in the subject. This directionality expresses the very sense of Kant's so-called Copernican revolution. The movement counter to nature is even more pronounced in Kant's practical philosophy. Morality itself lies in self-determination that, utterly detached from natural inclination, is carried out in accordance with the moral law. It is only in the critique of judgment that an exception is found, one that is all the more striking in that it occurs within a context in which, even as the beauty of natural things is discussed, there remain moments of retreat from nature. The relevant passage is that in which Kant affirms the contemplation of nature, or more precisely, intellectual interest in the beautiful in nature. Such interest attests, according to Kant, to a mental attunement to moral feeling. For a person so attuned will always take an interest in any trace that nature provides of its harmony with our own spirit and its law. It is precisely such a trace that nature offers in the purposiveness of its beauty. On this basis, Kant declares natural beauty superior to the beauty of art. The return to nature, as the turn from art to nature, he then expresses in a single, very remarkable sentence depicting the scene of such a return. And I quote, "A man who has taste enough to judge the products of fine art with the greatest correctness and refinement may still be glad to leave a room in which he finds those beauties that minister to vanity and perhaps to social joys, and to turn instead to the beautiful in nature in order to find there, as it were, a voluptuousness for his spirit in a train of thought that he can never fully lay out." That the trace of spirit is to be found in nature, through the return to nature, is a theme that resonates throughout post-Kantian thought, not only in the absolute form it assumes with Schelling and Hegel, but also in a quite different mode and tone with the New England Transcendentalists. Emerson writes incessantly of nature that, as he says, nature always wears the colors of the spirit, that nature is the symbol of spirit, and still more succinctly, that behind nature, throughout nature, spirit is present. Thus it is that the human spirit is expanded and enhanced by coming into proximity to nature, by returning from the detachment from nature enforced and inculcated by city life. In the poem that Emerson places at the head of his essay entitled Nature, he writes, "Spirit that lurks each form within beckons to spirit of its kin." In the essay itself, he describes the return from city to nature. He says, "At the gates of the forest, the surprised man of the world is forced to leave his city estimates of great and small, wise and foolish. The knapsack of custom falls off his back with the first steps he takes into these precincts. Here is sanctity, which shames our religions, and reality which discredits our heroes. Here we find nature to be the circumference which dwarfs every other circumstance, and judges like a god all men that come to her." Thoreau also writes of nature in such a way, though in a more exclamatory style, as near the beginning of Walden. He says, "To anticipate, not the sunrise and the dawn merely, but if possible, nature herself." Yet what is most distinct in the case of Thoreau is that he enacted the return, living alone for 2 years in the woods on the shore of Walden Pond, and transcribing that enactment in his book, Walden. In all these instances, the force of the imperative to return to nature is based on the capacity of nature to set before human sensibility a trace of spirit, or to offer a recovery of the originary. It is imperative that one return to nature because it is in and from nature that one is displayed to oneself in some specific manner, as submitted to measure, as spirit, or in the originary form that characterized the human in the state of nature. The return to nature is less for the sake of experiencing nature itself than for the sake of discovering in it something more originary that is reflected back from nature to oneself. If such reflective self-discovery is taken to be definitive of the human, then the imperative, return to nature, addressed to a person, is an absolute imperative, and one to which a person will always already have responded, regardless of whether the imperative has actually been addressed to that person. One will always already have been engaged, as we say, by one's nature in the return to nature, and the imperative by which one is addressed serves only to redouble the engagement. In German idealism, the reflection from nature back to the spiritual and originary comes to be thought in an absolutely decisive manner and in all its consequences. Thus, in delimiting the concept of nature at the outset of the philosophy of nature, Hegel writes, "Nature has arisen as the idea in the form of otherness." Still further, he writes that the idea is precisely this: to disclose itself, to posit this other, that is nature, outside itself, and to take it back again into itself in order to be subjectivity and spirit. Much more succinctly, Schelling declares that nature is visible spirit, and affirms, in his words, the absolute identity of spirit within us and nature outside us. Nature that comes to be thought as the originary, the idea in its otherness, in an externality, indeed as externality itself, to be cancelled as spirit emerges in its self-disclosure. The return to nature occurs only for the sake of the return, in turn, from nature back to spirit. In this ultimate return, nature is cancelled as mere nature, is relieved of its nature and is brought back to spirit, raised to the level of spirit. Here, Hegel's speculative word, Aufhebung, has its broadest extension. The determination of nature as both other than spirit and yet none other than spirit is reflected in the double sense borne by the word. For one speaks not only of nature, but also of the nature of things, even of the nature of nature. On the one side, the word designates the domain of natural things, mountains and rivers, trees and flowers, which is regarded as quite apart from the spiritual. But on the other side, it designates what something essentially is, its essence, which in modern thought is intrinsically allied with subjectivity or spirit. Yet this double sense of nature extends back to Greek antiquity. Already in the Platonic dialogues, the word phusis, the Greek word for nature, is commonly used in both senses. In its broader application, the word signifies, on the one side, the domain or origin of natural things, and on the other side, the ide, the forms, as we badly translate it, are designated, the ide that define all such things, that determine them to be what they are, thus constituting the answer to the question, TST, what is? As correlative to noesis, the ide are designated as noeta, as what comes to be called the intelligible. And the intelligible is then distinguished from the aestheta, the sensible. The dyad of intelligible and sensible, that is thus designated, comes therefore to encompass in its span the entire range of being, and as such it provides the founding distinction of what comes to be called metaphysics. In its double sense, nature enjoys the same gigantic span. Nothing lies outside this span, neither beyond it nor before it. Nothing lies outside of nature. Hence, the return to nature will always be also a return within nature. And yet, both in classical antiquity and in our time, this ontological configuration, intelligible, sensible, has been disrupted. The disruption of the intelligible, sensible dyad involves, though in very different ways, the emergence of another sense of nature. In classical antiquity, this disruption occurs in its most manifest form in Plato's Timaeus. In the account given of how the godly demiurgos, the maker, formed the cosmos, the dyad of intelligible and sensible is affirmed, and indeed is woven into the entire first discourse that Timaeus delivers. And yet, precisely at the point where the discourse focuses most intently on the order in the heavens, a certain disordering begins to announce itself. As a result, Timaeus interrupts his discourse and proposes to begin again from the beginning. In the second discourse, which then follows, this interruption proves to have been the interruption of the intelligible, sensible dyad. Not that Timaeus rejects the dyad, not that he simply rejects the dyad of intelligible, sensible, or in any way puts it aside. Rather, along with these two kinds, intelligible, sensible, he introduces a third kind. Thereby, he both demonstrates that the dyad is not comprehensive. There is a third thing. that it does not encompass the entire range of being, and that its very possibility is based on the third kind. The third kind is named in numerous ways, all of which, even the designation third kind, are necessarily consigned to what Timaeus terms bastard discourse. Timaeus declares it to be like gold that can be molded into all possible shapes. He also calls it by the name ekmageon, which designates a mass of wax or other salt material on which the imprint of a seal can be stamped. These are the different descriptions. He calls it also hupodoke, commonly translated as receptacle, and most insistently by the name kora, untranslatable. These different designations are cast in such a way that they clash and utterly resist being brought together into a single image of a certain kind. For what is being named, this third kind, in a necessarily bastardly way, is neither a kind, that is an intelligible eidos, nor an image of a kind, that is a sensible thing. The word phusis, the Greek word for nature, is scattered throughout the Timaeus and is used in several different senses. Early in the dialogue, Timaeus is described as one who has made it his task to know, as he puts it, about the nature of the all. Much later, when Timaeus actually enumerates the three kinds, he refers to the offspring, that is, the sensible, as the phusis between the other two. But among the many usages of the word, there are two that are especially significant in the present context. One is exemplified when Timaeus speaks his words about the nature that receives all bodies. In this phrase, it is the third kind that is designated as nature, as a nature other than the nature that Timaeus described in his first discourse. The other usage occurs when, as he proposes to begin again, Timaeus enjoins his interlocutors that, his words, we must bring into view the nature itself of fire and water and air and earth before the birth of the heaven. The reference is to what will prove to be not the elements themselves, but rather the elements as not yet themselves, as mere traces held in the kora. This entire scene lies before the birth of the heaven. It is a nature that preceded nature, a nature older than sensible nature. Let me pass over the renewal and development that such a concept of nature underwent with Schelling, who called it die alte Natur, the old nature, in order now to address the way in which, in our time, that is, from Nietzsche on, the classical ontological configuration is disrupted. This disruption is encapsulated in a single sentence in the prologue to Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It is a performative utterance that borders on issuing an imperative. It reads, I beseech you, my brother, remain true to the earth, bleibt der Erde treu, and do not believe those who speak to you of otherworldly hopes. Here the earth represents the things of the earth, that is, the sensible, and the otherworldly represents the intelligible. Now that, in Nietzsche's idiom, the allegedly true world, the otherworldly, has finally become, as he says, a fable. What the sentence announces is thus an inversion of the classical configuration. an inversion by which the sensible is now to be regarded as the true world, while the intelligible is allowed to drift away into oblivion, that is abolished. There remains, so it seems, only the sensible, only nature in the sense of the sensible. It is to this nature, the only nature, that Nietzsche implores his brothers to return. To philosophize after Nietzsche would require a return to nature in which there are mountains and rivers, trees and flowers. And yet, in Nietzsche's celebrated account of how the true world finally became a fable, the abolition of the intelligible constitutes only the penultimate stage. What follows in the final stage thoroughly disrupts the direct and seemingly self-evident return to nature that would seem to be prescribed. Here is Nietzsche's account of the final stage. He says, "The true world we have abolished. What world has remained? The apparent one, perhaps? But no. With the true world, we have also abolished the apparent one." Yet what is the sense of this final graphic deed, this claim to have abolished the apparent, that is, the sensible world? For most certainly, the sensible world is not, in its actuality, abolished. It is not done away with. We open our eyes or tune our ears, and behold, the things of sense are there before us. While it may be that the intelligible, since it was never more than a specter, according to Nietzsche, has vanished completely and has only to be put out of our minds, erased from our memory, the sensible stubbornly persists in its perceptibility and in its portals and resistance to our endeavors. What is it then about the sensible that has been abolished? It is only and precisely its character as apparent, as scheinbar, as appearance, Erscheinung, of something beyond it, namely of the intelligible. Because since classical antiquity, the sensible has always been understood by reference to the intelligible, the abolition of the intelligible deprives the sensible of the determination it has borne throughout the history of metaphysics. Now that it can no longer be understood as imaging the intelligible, the sensible is utterly lacking in determination. Now that it stands alone, there is no telling what it is, not at least in a discourse that continues to be governed by the conceptuality of metaphysics. Now that there remains only the nature in which there are mountains and rivers, trees and flowers, the very sense of nature must be determined anew. Now we must, like Timaeus, begin again from the beginning. A beginning can be discerned in certain directions taken in the development of phenomenology from Heidegger on. Responding to the Nietzschean injunction, being in time sets sensible beings free of the intelligible. No longer are they determined as imaging a remote intelligible set beyond them, nor as grounded in the pure concepts of a transcendental subject or spirit. Rather, they are taken as determined by their insertion in a world, by their placement within the referential structures that constitute a world The world itself is nothing set beyond the sensible within it. Without itself being a sensible being, it belongs nonetheless to the domain of the sensible. It is of the sensible, even though not itself a sensible being. Though in Heidegger's early thought the world is intrinsically bound to the human, this bond is not a grounding, nor is the human taken as a transcendental subject or as spirit. In the development of Heidegger's thought that begins in Contributions to Philosophy, even this bond is broken, and whatever affinity there might have been with the metaphysics of the subject is eliminated. Merleau-Ponty's conception of the invisible as that which, without itself being visible, belongs to and indeed renders possible the visible, extends and develops the redetermination of the sensible that frees it from governance by an intelligible beyond. But what does this beginning, ventured in phenomenology, entail with regard to the determination of the sense of nature? Is nature to be regarded simply as the totality of sensible beings? Most certainly it was not so regarded by the ancients. Even in Aristotle, the distinction persists between nature and natural things, between physis and ta physeanta. Nature itself, Aristotle defines as an inner arche that governs the origination and growth of natural things. While the Timaeus does sometimes employ the word physis in reference to sensible beings, it also applies the word to other kinds, such as the chora, that are rigorously distinguished from sensible beings. Kant, too, avoids simply identifying nature with the totality of sensible beings. In a highly significant footnote in the Critique of Pure Reason, he distinguishes between a formal or adjectival sense of nature and a material or substantive sense. Nature in the latter sense, material sense, he identifies as, in his words, the sum of appearances insofar as they are thoroughly interconnected. These are, says Kant, the things of nature, while nature itself is a subsisting whole. He distinguishes this sense of nature from the formal sense, according to which nature designates, his words, the connection of the determinations of a thing according to an inner principle of causality. Hence, nature in the formal sense is not a totality of beings, but rather the connection between their determinations. Nature in this sense consists not of beings, but of the connection by which they are determined as what they are. In view of these historical indications, the question needs to be addressed as to whether there are discernible moments or entities that, while intrinsically related to sensible beings, nonetheless are distinct from them. Is it possible, beyond the structure of world, Heidegger, and the conception of the invisible, Merleau-Ponty, to discern and determine moments, configurations, or even entities that go beyond, that exceed the domain of sensible beings, that lie outside it, such that if nature is to include these, it cannot be identified simply as the totality of sensible beings? There are at least two such moments or kinds of entities that can be discerned. Each has the effect of rendering nature as something in excess of the mere totality of sensible beings, One has come to light very recently. The other is to be retrieved from very ancient sources. The first corresponds to the discovery in recent astrophysics of beings that are not sensible, that by their very nature cannot be presented to sense. Among the several instances of such beings, the most obtrusively excessive are black holes. Such beings have a structure that in no way corresponds to that of a terrestrial thing, of a being having sensibly perceptible properties. A black hole is centered in a singularity, which is an intense concentration of very large mass, at least several times that of our sun, that converges asymptotically toward a point. Consequently, it has such enormous density that its gravity prevents even light from escaping. That is, the escape velocity is greater than the speed of light. As distance from the singularity increases, the escape velocity decreases, and at a certain distance, it is equal to the speed of light. This distance defines the extent of the black hole. The imaginary sphere described by this radius constitutes what is called the event horizon. This is the place of no return for light. In its vicinity, a shower of particles is produced, and it is only the presence of this peculiarly configured array of particles that allows the event horizon, itself entirely invisible, to be detected. Light and everything else that reaches the event horizon will disappear into the black hole. Since no light can escape it, the black hole is entirely invisible. Not really black as a thing can be black, which would still be visible, but absolutely invisible. The invisibility of a black hole is a kind of invisibility hitherto unknown, indeed virtually inconceivable. It is not an invisibility that can be breached and converted in degree or manner into visibility, as with the unseen other side of an object, or as with a perceptual horizon. Neither is its invisibility comparable at all to that ascribed by metaphysics to the intelligible, for it belongs not apart from sensible things, but in their very midst. A black hole is a being that, by virtue of what it is, cannot in any manner be present to sense. It is a being that is not a sensible being. Yet as set among such things, it presumably belongs to nature. This belonging expands the concept of nature beyond that of the totality of sensible beings. The second of the moments or entities by which nature exceeds the mere totality of sensible beings can be discerned by taking up the connection drawn in the Timaeus between nature, especially in the sense of the Korah, and the traces of the elements. This connection points back to the elemental thinking of early Greek philosophers such as Anaximenes, Heraclitus, and especially Empedocles. For all these figures, thinking is, as such, directed to phusis, and phusis, nature, is thought primarily as the gathering of the elements. Engagement with these ancient sources prompts a renewal of the sense of element in the sense still heard when we speak of being exposed to the elements. Even the elements named by the ancients, in names barely translatable as fire, air, water, and earth, even these open towards senses that resist appropriation by metaphysics. Elements such as light and sky, wind and rain, the sea, the earth. These expand the sense of nature, not as with black holes by being nonsensical, not by remaining withdrawn from sense. On the contrary, the elements surround us and are imminently displayed before our senses. In the blue of the sky, the brilliance of the light, the coolness of the wind, the sound of the falling rain. What is decisive is that the elements are encompassing, but they are not determinately bounded, but rather display a certain indefiniteness not to be found in things. That they betoken also a depth, unlike the profile-determined depth of things. By elaborating these and other features, a rigorous distinction can be drawn between elements on the one side and things or objects on the other. By including also the elements, nature exceeds the mere sum of sensible things. There remains still the question as to whether, granted these moments of excess, the extent of nature is to be limited, or whether nature is to be determined as including all that is, hence as coextensive with being. Would it be possible, for the sake of accord with what Emerson calls the common sense of nature, to distinguish it from the cosmos at large? Could such a distinction be drawn without simply reinstating in another guise the Ptolemaic distinction, long since refuted, between the sublunary world and the incorruptible heaven? One possibility would be to regard the sky as the limit separating nature from the cosmos. For, like any genuine limit, the sky displays a peculiar relation to each of the regions it would distinguish. From within nature and to the senses naturally employed, the sky appears as a uniform dome that, together with the earth, encloses the incorporeal space in which the things that concern humans come to pass. But when the senses are supplemented, as by powerful telescopes, so that humans can look beyond the surface appearance that is the sky as such dissolves and becomes an opening onto the cosmos. If such a distinction between nature and cosmos were to be elaborated, then while extraterrestrial entities such as black holes would be regarded as beyond nature, the cosmos, they could nonetheless be taken as attesting to the limit of the sensible. For such entities do not present themselves to the senses. If in the wake of the Nietzschean inversion, there is presentation only to the senses, then it follows that such entities do not present themselves at all. Recognition of such entities would require, then, that the very sense of being as presence be suspended. Yet within nature, presence would remain decisive, at least in connection with the elements. It is in this regard that one could begin to elaborate a sense of the imperative, turning to nature, beyond the range of the Nietzschean inversion. For quite apart from theoretical reflections on nature, humans share a capacity to be entranced by elemental nature. When we stand motionless and silent, with our gaze fixed upon a towering mountain peak or an expanse of sea stretching to the horizon, our interest is neither in seeing what a mountain or the sea looks like, nor in coming to know what its essence is. Rather, standing in the presence of the elemental, we simply abide with it and let our senses be absorbed by it. In giving ourselves over to it, we at the same time enhance our sense of belonging to the elemental, in a sense of sense irreducible to mere perception and to essential cognition. By engaging such an elemental sense, a path can perhaps be opened for rethinking the return to nature in a manner that at once advances beyond mere inversion, while also returning to the beginnings of Western philosophy. Thank you.